what I wanted to do with this piece on competitive priorities was just to give a little bit of background on how competitive priorities come to be. So next, how they're used, where they come from, how we look at them, just to give you the background on them. And then you'll be, I understand, hearing from people who have applied for these programs in the past on how they've responded to competitive priorities. And I think that will give you a better sense of how to address them. But we want to give you a little bit of the background. So we use competitive priorities. We use priorities and funding priorities generally, which I'll address, as a means of focusing applicants. So the purpose is to identify strategies that we think need to be addressed for some particular reason, we think will help create stronger programs, or give us an opportunity to have you test strategies and see how they are working. So it gives us an opportunity to just express our interests in this particular program. Where they come from primarily is the program's authorizing legislation. So we'll talk about that. This program has 4 specific priorities that are in our legislation. For the past number of years, the Secretary has published proposed priorities, or his or her priorities in the Federal Register, and that process is taking place right now. And what's important about that is that it provides you some insight into the policy interests of the particular secretary. I had mentioned on the earlier section about MSAP in general that much of what we are working on comes from statute, it comes from Congress, but there are opportunities for an administration to shape the edges of this program, and that will come through the Secretary's proposed priorities. And then there are program-specific regulations for magnet schools for MSAP, and that's another source from which we can draw to identify priorities. How they're assessed is either by peer reviewers as part of the general selection process, or by staff members. And the point values can either be 0 or X. So either this priority is evident or it's not. And in those cases, we'll generally have staff members identify in the application, was this present? Occasionally, we'll ask our peer reviewers to help us with that process, but it's up to us to say, yes, this was evident. And then in the cases where it's up to X, up to 3 points or 4 points, that's a question of the quality of the response. And so we'll ask our peer reviewers to help us with that. Rarely the priorities should be make it or break it, but they are an opportunity to increase your overall score, to some extent. And again, to address areas that we think need to be focused on. So let me come back to funding priorities generally next. So generally speaking, there are 3 types of funding priorities that the department can add to a competition: absolute, competitive, or invitational. Absolute means that the applicant must address in order to be considered for funding an absolute priority. As of right now, there are no absolute priorities on MSAP, and we don't know that there will be, but it is a possibility. The competitive is largely what we're talking about today, where the applicant has the option of choosing whether or not to address that specific priority and may receive additional points for it. And then finally, invitational. The applicant's encouraged but not required to address an invitational priority, and it will not convey any preference as a result. It is a way, again, of our signaling an interest in a particular topic, or seeing several applicants that might be experimenting with a particular approach. Next. So in terms of, again, of where these come from, the first source is our legislative source, and this is a link to ESSA overall. You're going to go to section, it's the section 4401 and part D of section 4. And there are 4 competitive priorities laid out. The first is need for assistance, and that is fairly narrowly tailored to the expense or difficulty of effectively carrying out approved desegregation plans and the magnet school for which the grant is being sought. So it's asking the question of how does this funding source fit in with the overall funding that might be available for magnet schools for desegregation, and how does this address needs that may not be otherwise met. The second priority has to do with new or revised magnet schools. And in that case, this is really showing our priority around evidence and effectiveness. That has been a big priority for the department and for Congress in grant making. So there are 3 ways that you can show that you are doing this. You can either be carrying out new evidence-based magnet school programs, significantly revised magnet school programs that are using evidence-based methods or practices, or replicating existing magnet school programs that have demonstrated record of success in both increasing student academic achievement and reducing isolation of minority groups. So that is where our evidence of effectiveness comes in. The third priority is selection of students, and that has to do with addressing one of the big barriers for segregation in selective schools, which is identifying means of selecting students through systems of lottery or other approaches rather than academic examinations, which have been shown to further segregation. And then lastly, socioeconomic diversity. This was added in ESSA and was added in our last competition. And it is to increase racial integration by taking into account socioeconomic diversity in designing and implementing magnet schools. And anecdotally, we think that this is a really important one. We believe that our programs that have focused well on drawing a diverse group of students socioeconomically and in specifically recruiting a socioeconomically diverse group have also had big benefits in racial diversity as well, and addressing minority group isolation. So that is what is in our legislation. Next, I wanted to talk about some of the previous additional priorities. So over the years, those 3 to 4 priorities I just talked about have been fairly steady. But there have been other priorities that are put in reflecting that administration's particular priorities or concerns. So in 2010, there was a priority to expand the capacity to provide choice. That was a big part of the No Child Left Behind Act. In 2013, we were focused on promoting STEM education. In 2016, we again were working on promoting STEM education. And that's where we began introducing this strategies for which there's evidence of promise. And trying to increase the evidence base. In 2017, the racial integration and socioeconomic diversity component was added, and then added through ESSA. And then in our last competition, you saw the addition of opportunity zones. This has happened over time. Different administrations will identify means of prioritizing particular communities that might have need. Opportunity zones was the way that the last administration was prioritizing particular communities, and that was an opportunity within MSAP to focus services in some of those opportunity zones. That will not be part of this competition. That's not a priority for this administration in the same way that title opportunity zones. They may identify a similar means of targeting particular communities of need, but it will not be opportunity zones. Next. So to talk a little bit about what this administration is interested in and what you might find added as competitive priorities or other funding priorities. I've mentioned in the last session I did about Secretary's proposed priorities. This is a notice that was published and closed, I believe, at the end of July, and will be issued, over the next few months. The department will respond to the comments that came in on that notice, and ideally make a set of priorities official that the department staff can draw on in crafting our competitions. There are 6 areas that have been identified, and then within those 6 areas, there's quite a bit of subcomponents. It is very worth looking at those proposed priorities until they are official. Again, it just gives you a sense of what the priorities of this administration are and what will be shaping not just this competition, but a number of competitions. The first one has to do with addressing the impact of COVID-19. The second is very much in MSAP's wheelhouse. It is promoting equity in student access to educational resources, opportunities, and welcoming environments. The third has to do with supporting a diverse educator workforce and professional growth to strengthen student learning. So really investing in our workforce and considering the diversity of it as it meets students' needs. The fourth one is meeting student social, emotional, and academic needs. This is a big issue that the administration has seen in returning back to school with and addressing the issues of COVID, how important socio-emotional learning is. The fifth one, I didn't include the entire title. It's very long, and it has to do with post-secondary education access, which is a little bit less in our wheelhouse, but that is the 5th priority. And then the 6th one has to do with strengthening cross-agency coordination and community engagement to advance systemic change. And that's always been of interest in MSAP, looking at the ways that agencies at the state and federal and local level can work together, whether it's housing or transportation or other social services, to strengthen the capacities of magnet schools and the ability to serve the students that we're hoping to recruit as part of desegregation plans. Finally, next slide. In our regulations for MSAP, there is a specific set of criteria that can be drawn on to create priorities. I said here also selection criteria, and I had originally thought that I was going to include the department's, it's called EDGAR, I'm blanking on the exact title of what that means. And that is the department's governing regulations, which include ways that we can select selection criteria, those sort of subcomponents to the major areas that you are addressing through the application. Through the regulations for MSAP, it outlines selection criteria that we can also use for competitive priorities. To touch back on scoring next. Our regulations say that we can only go up to 30 points for competitive priorities. So in 2020, that applicants can gain up to 11 additional points. So it could be more, it could be less than last time, but it can't exceed 30 points in addition to the 100 points for selection criteria. There is a special provision for competitions that exceed $75 million, which this upcoming competition very well might. In it, it says essentially that applicants who didn't receive funds under the last competition, after the awards are made up to 75 million or are proposed up to 75 million, that additional amount of funding should be those applicants that did not receive funding in the last competition, so in 2020, should receive priority by being given 10 additional points. So that's a process that we will be working out. It essentially requires that we create 2 slates for the first 75 million and then a priority in the additional funds. And then I mentioned before that the competitive priorities can be reviewed by either peer reviewers or staff. Again, assessing if the applicant meets the criteria or not, or assessing the quality of the response on a spectrum. So next, in short, MSAP will definitely, our next competition will definitely have the 4 legislative competitive priorities. So you definitely want to think about those. It is possible that there will be additional competitive priorities, and the best place to look for those is either in the notice of proposed priorities for the secretary, or in our regulations to get a sense of the kinds of things that MSAP could prioritize. I do want to say, just to remember what I said earlier, which is you really want to have a plan for what you're trying to achieve in your LEA or consortium of LEAs. And, ideally, the competitive priorities help you to think about some areas that you might also want to include, or which you're already planning to do and can really amp up through your application. But it shouldn't be determinant. In the end, the most important thing is that you are writing the application that you think is strongest, that you're going to be able to actually carry out and achieve, and for which peer reviewers should review and assess that you are able to complete. So I think the last thing I will leave you with is next. It's just good luck.